Okay, everyone? Okay, sorry. Lana, okay? Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to make this brief as well so we can keep moving. Yeah, okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. I was at an historical place last year and somebody said to me, "Oh, so what? They had slaves. Big deal. Everybody had slaves back then. Who cares?" I think the next day I had a lunch with Lana Castro and Tara D'Amato, who is our assistant director. She's not here today. Two fantastic women. Incidentally, all the women I work with are absolutely fantastic. Carolyn Curtin in the back, Alexandra Kalutis in the back, Nicole, Mally, Roman Yallo in the back. Here is a feminist man raised by a wonderful woman. And Monique went out to get more food. Everyone I work with is fantastic, and there's a lot of support. So I think I had about 5 margaritas, and I said to Lana, "I am so sick of that attitude about slavery. Oh, they had slaves, big deal." No. So I said, if we do this conference, I said, I really want to talk about enslaved women on Long Island. So fortunately, I met Melanie, I knew about her, and I'm just going to preface the talk really fast with one of my favorite books. This is actually Diane's book, The Cooking Gene by Michael Twitty. He talks about a journey through African-American culinary history in the Old South, and he says, it is the only way we are going to be able to move forward and get the blood memory of slavery out of our legacy is for you to sit down, break bread with me. We're going to look at slavery in the face in all of its ugliness and all of its horror, and then we are going to agree that it actually happened, acknowledge that it did happen, and then we're going to shake hands and agree that it can never happen again. So, Melanie, take it away.
Good morning. I feel very honored to be introduced by Maura, but also with the words of Michael Twitty before me, because he is one of my absolute favorite food historians for American history. I've had the opportunity to meet him and have a book signed by him, so to see that book and to hear his words makes me feel really great to start this talk out with today. So I want to begin this presentation by acknowledging a woman whose name we will never know. In the late 18th century on eastern Long Island, a woman lived on a small farm. Each morning, she rose before dawn to prepare the household's first meal. She spent the day cooking, washing clothes, preserving food for the winter, caring for children, and helping maintain the farm economy that sustained the household. Her labor kept that household running during the years surrounding the American Revolution. And as she worked, she would have heard the conversations that filled homes across the colonies. Talk of freedom, liberty, and independence. She would have heard the language of revolution. She would have heard men debate taxation and representation. She would have heard the promise that all men were created equal. But none of those ideas applied to her. If we look for her in the records of the time, letters, census lists, estate inventories, and house ledgers, we would find evidence of her work and whispers of her existence everywhere. The food prepared, the laundry done, and the children cared for, the farm sustained. But more often than not, we would not find her name. Instead, she appears only briefly in the archives, sometimes as a number in a census column or an unnamed Negro woman or wench in a will. Because the woman I'm describing is not the farmer's wife or even the farmer's daughter. She was a woman held in slavery. And once we recognize that the records she leaves behind begin to look different. In some cases, the documents are starkly impersonal. All right, let me just grab this, see if this works. Yay, excellent. In some cases, the documents left behind are starkly impersonal. A probate inventory might list an enslaved woman by a single name, or sometimes no name at all. Placed in a column between a farm animal or a set of tools. In a household ledger, she might appear as only a labor expense, or in a census column as a single mark indicating a presence of an enslaved person in the household. These records confirm that she was there and that her labor was essential to the household's functioning, but they rarely tell us who she was, what she thought, or how she understood the world that was changing around her. And recovering the lives and labor of the women like her who helped bear the weight of the war and create a nation, but were denied the promises that it contained, is a focus of this presentation. When Americans think of slavery in the United States, we often imagine the plantation South. But during the colonial and revolutionary periods, New York had the largest, New York had the largest enslaved population of any colony north of Maryland. By the early 1700s, more than 42% of New York City households held slaves, a percentage higher than the cities of Boston and Philadelphia, and second only to Charleston in the South. By the start of the Revolution, there were an estimated 21,000 enslaved people in the state. Long Island in particular held one of the largest concentrations of enslaved in the North, but the exact numbers are difficult to ascertain because of how population counts were done. Numbers are from the records from the time period closest to the American Revolution conflate free and enslaved black people in these census records. So sometimes it said 32% of population of Kings County, 20% of Queens, which later became Nassau, some of it, and 11% of Suffolk County were enslaved, but some of these numbers also include free black people. Unlike the plantation systems of the South, slavery on Long Island was typically organized around small households and farms. While there were larger sites of enslavement in the state, the majority of enslavers on Long Island owned 1, 2, 3, sometimes 5 enslaved people. In New York City, enslaved populations included a higher percentage of women compared to men. This was because of the domestic demand of domestic servants and that style of slavery in the city. But on Long Island, men were favored for agricultural work. In addition, enslaved people were more thinly distributed out on Long Island, often leaving women isolated in individual homes with far fewer opportunities to build community with other enslaved women. For enslaved women, this meant living directly within the households of their enslavers, sleeping in kitchens, attics, or in cellars, while remaining under constant supervision. This close proximity did not make slavery easier or gentler. In fact, the isolation of small-scale slavery often meant that enslaved women had far fewer opportunities to build community networks or support systems with other enslaved people as they would in large southern plantations. This purported familiar bonds did not protect enslaved women from being sold to cover a debt, having their children given away or abandoned to the overseer of the poor, or being willed to family members at the time of their enslaver's death. They lived and worked alongside families who spoke passionately about liberty, even as those basic rights were denied to them. The history of slavery in New York stretches back to its early days of European colonization. Africans and people of African descent were present in the Atlantic world from the very beginning of European exploration. Free and enslaved Africans participated in early voyages to the Americas, meaning that people of African descent were part of New York's story from its very earliest moments. In 1626 or 1627, there we go, only a few years after the Dutch West Indies Company established New Amsterdam, 11 enslaved African and men of African descent were brought into the colony to labor on farms and infrastructure. Under Dutch rule, slavery operated very differently than what would later become under the English. Enslaved people were granted a narrow set of rights. Families often kept together. They could be admitted into the Dutch Reformed Church, and their children could be baptized. Some could testify in court, sign legal documents, and even bring civil cases against white colonists. A few were allowed to work for wages in their limited free time. From this system emerged half freedom, a conditional status in which enslaved people were somewhat free, but paid an annual tax and continued laboring for the West Indies Company. But that conditional freedom did not extend to their children. They remained company property. For enslaved women, this reality was especially brutal because it meant that bearing children ensured the continuation of slavery itself. As the colony grew, so did the reliance on enslaved labor. Men and women were brought from Africa and the Caribbean to build and sustain the settlement, many of them living just beyond the walls of the colony, past the very structures they built. Just as a side note, that wall exists today in New York. Today we know it as Wall Street. That was the barrier of the colony, and the enslaved population lived outside the wall in a small community. By the mid-17th century, slavery had also reached Long Island. In 1651, Sylvester Manor was established on Shelter Island as a provisioning plantation for Caribbean slave colonies. Nathaniel and Grizel Sylvester brought enslaved Africans from the Barbados, likely the first enslaved people on the East End, to labor on the island that supplied food and materials to the plantation economy of the Caribbean. In the 1660s, as the colony transitioned from Dutch to English control, the Dutch West Indian Company freed the enslaved people it still held, creating an early free black community in the region. But this brief moment of possibility of freedom did not last. Under English rule, these small rights and privileges were stripped away. When the English took full control of New Netherlands in 1664, slavery hardened into the system of chattel slavery. Enslaved Africans were imported directly from Africa or from the West Indies in growing numbers, many passing through slave markets in New York City before being sold or hired out across the colony, including on Long Island. However, an unknown number of slaves were smuggled onto the island by those wishing to evade the high taxes on importation of slaves. Slave vessels were frequently disguised as whaling ships to prevent suspicious customs agents from examining their cargo. These whaling vessels would continue to smuggle enslaved Africans into New York up to the start of the American Civil War in 1861. The East End ports of Sag Harbor and Shelter Island were also included with direct trade with the West Indies, Africa, and Europe. Although the number of enslaved people in the households was often small, slavery was deeply embedded in the region's economy. Enslaved men and women worked at every level of colonial society, from small farms to wealthy estates in New York City, performing labor that ranged from agricultural and domestic work to skilled trades. For enslaved women in particular, this labor was both productive and reproductive. Many maintained households, worked fields and gardens, and bore children whose status would determine the future of the system itself. One of the most prominent figures on Long Island during the American Revolutionary era was William Floyd, a landowner in Mastic and one of New York's signers of the Declaration of Independence. Like many wealthy landowners in the region, Floyd relied on enslaved labor to sustain his estate. According to the 1790 federal census, of the 563 households in the town of Brookhaven, 103, or 18%, held slaves. Of these households, only 9 held more than 5 enslaved individuals, with Floyd holding the largest at 14. Among them were women whose labor sustained the household and whose children were born into slavery. Floyd was not unusual in this regard. Many of the leading families on Long Island and throughout New York, including men who supported the Patriot cause, relied on enslaved labor to sustain their farms and estates. Slavery was woven into the daily functionings of these households, even as their owners participated in a political movement built on language of liberty and natural rights. Despite the gradual emancipation laws that followed the Revolution, Floyd never freed the people he enslaved. Rather than manumitting the 6 remaining enslaved persons at the time of his death, he willed them to his heirs. Even in death, the inequality of the system remains visible. Members of the Floyd family were buried in marked graves, befitting their status, and their monuments still stand today. Nearby, a modern memorial acknowledges the enslaved people who lived and worked at the estate, yet their final resting places are left unidentified on the grounds of the site. The memorial recognizes their presence today, but it also reminds us how thoroughly their lives were excluded from the historical record. The daily work of enslaved women on Long Island was relentless. They cooked meals, they cleaned homes, they laundered clothing, they preserved food for winter, they spun thread and wove cloth, they tended gardens and cared for children. Many also worked outdoors alongside enslaved men in agricultural labor. During the Revolution, this labor became even more critical. Long Island was occupied by the British forces for much of the war, and food shortages were common. Households relied heavily on the labor of enslaved women to maintain farms, preserve food, and stretch limited resources. In many cases, enslaved women were the people who kept those households functioning, while the men who owned them were absent, fighting in the war, or engaged in political affairs. Their work sustained households and communities during the turmoil of the Revolutionary War. They cooked the meals eaten by patriot families. They washed the soldiers' clothing. They maintained the farms that fed communities struggling through the wartime shortages. In other words, enslaved women's labor helped sustain the society that was fighting for its own independence. Yet the ideals of the Revolution rarely extended to them. In a very real sense, the enslaved women were helping bear the nation itself. The farms they sustained fed communities during wartime. The households they maintained supported revolutionary families. And the children they bore expanded the labor system that fueled an early American economy. In ways both visible and invisible, enslaved women helped build the society that would become the United States, even as that new nation denied them the freedom it claimed to defend. Long before the American Revolution, slavery in New York was enforced through a series of black codes or slave laws that tightly controlled the lives of both free and enslaved black people. These laws restricted limited gatherings and funerals, imposed severe punishments for resistance and escape. Free black New Yorkers were prohibited from owning a house, purchasing a land, and transferring property to their children. These laws made it clear that black people, both free and enslaved, were not simply laborers within households or residents, but individuals whose movements, work, and bodies were regulated by law. But for enslaved women, slavery was shaped not just by race, but also by gender. Under New York law, a child's status followed that of its mother. This meant that every child born to an enslaved woman inherited slavery at the time of birth. Motherhood, therefore, carried a painful contradiction. An enslaved woman might hear the rhetoric of freedom while knowing that any child she bore would legally be owned by another person. So behind me, I'm kind of blocking it, is just a handful of some of the laws that were black or slave laws in the state. So it's as simple as anyone older than the age of 14 could not walk around at night without a lantern. Slaves could not hold funerals at night. They had a home during the daytime. Groups no more than 14 at one time and then later 4. So every movement, every part of their lives, whether or not you were free or enslaved, was controlled by the law. The dangers enslaved women faced in New York were starkly illustrated by the panic surrounding the 1741 slave conspiracy. After a series of fires in New York City led authorities to accuse several enslaved people and poor residents of plotting a rebellion against the colonial government, over 180 people were arrested. The resulting trials created a climate of fear throughout the city and the rest of the state as well. Courts relied heavily on informants and coerced testimony, and many of the accused were executed or transported out of the colony. Among those condemned was a pregnant enslaved woman. Under colonial law, her execution was delayed until after she gave birth, not out of compassion, but because the child she carried was legally considered to be property. Once the child was born, the sentence was carried out. However, enslaved women did not simply endure this system. They also resisted it. Some ran away. Others resisted through everyday acts, slowing their work, feigning illness, or refusing to perform tasks exactly as demanded. I don't know how many of you bake, but sometimes sugar and salt look exactly the same. I mess up all the time, and I'm a trained cook. I'm just leaving it out there. For enslaved women, resistance could also take deeply personal forms. Because the law declared that a child inherited the status of the mother, enslaved women's reproductive lives were directly tied to the continuation of slavery itself. Some enslaved women attempted to assert control over their own bodies through the use of contraceptive knowledge passed through generations. And in rare cases, enslaved mothers resorted to infanticide rather than allow their children to grow up in bondage. These acts reveal the desperate choices enslaved women sometimes faced in a world where they had almost no legal control over their own lives, their own bodies, or the lives of their children. The contradictions between revolutionary ideals and the reality of slavery became increasingly difficult to ignore in the years after the war. But New York did not abolish slavery immediately. In 1799, New York passed its first Gradual Emancipation Act. Under this law, children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of that year were legally considered free, but they were required to serve long periods of indentured servitude for their mother's enslaver. Girls were bound until the age of 25, and boys until the age of 28. In practice, this meant that slavery continued in New York for decades. Women who were already enslaved remained enslaved for life. Their children were legally classified as indentured servants bound to the same households that enslaved their mothers. For many families, this meant that freedom arrived slowly and unevenly. A mother might remain enslaved for life, while the child that she bore was technically free, but still required to labor for decades in the same household. A second law passed in 1817 declared that those still enslaved in New York would be freed on July 4th, 1827. That's a 10-year difference. Even then, freedom came with limitations. Many formerly enslaved people faced restrictions on property ownership, employment, and movement. Others had already been sold south or separated from their families long before emancipation arrived. For enslaved women, gradual emancipation carried particularly painful implications. Women continued to bear children into a system that still controlled their labor and their families. Freedom, in other words, did not arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, unevenly, and often too late for those women whose labor had sustained New York's households during the Revolutionary era. The history of slavery in the North and the experiences of women in particular has long been obscured but within the historical record. Early scholarship focused heavily on political leaders, economic systems, and the experiences of enslaved men, while the lives of enslaved women only appear briefly. At the same time, the North gradually reshaped the story it told about itself. As gradual emancipation unfolded, newspapers, local histories, and public commemorations increasingly emphasized a regional identity built on free white labor. The local histories and biographies from this time, many of which still are on the shelves of our libraries and local history rooms, I know this because they're in my local history room, often celebrated the lives of revolutionary leaders while minimizing or ignoring the enslaved labor that sustained their households. For example, early biographies of Floyd focused almost entirely on his role as a revolutionary patriot. When slavery was mentioned, if at all, it was minimized, and the people he enslaved were sometimes simply described as Negro servants, with authors portraying Floyd as a benevolent owner. Other works seem to take light of the institution of slavery, such as Nathaniel R. Howell's biography of General William Floyd. Published in 1954, Howell states that there was an atmosphere of friendship and a spirit of devotion felt by the slaves towards their masters in the slave household. Here's another example, which is often repeated in articles and papers as of today. I'm just going to step aside so you guys can read it. Let me see. I'll pull it up so I can read it as well. Let me see if I could do this. These slaves must have worked well for their masters, and they were treated well in turn. As a general rule, slaves on Long Island must have led quite happy lives. Many of the masters were kind and considerate of their slaves' welfare. The slide then goes on to tell a story of an old woman who, when her child she had raised as a nursemaid, it gets married, she willingly goes along with that family to sit in a corner and tell stories about the child's family, and just being there of no good use, as it says in the quote, and also goes on to mention that children were often just given to the wife as a dowry. These quotes and this information, written in the 1950s, 40s, late 1800s, are still used in papers, articles today. They do not take into consideration the historical archive. These portrayals often reflect the biases of historians who wrote them rather than the experiences of the enslaved themselves, and unfortunately, as I said, are often repeated today as fact. And when these works remain unchallenged, they help perpetuate the long-standing myth that slavery in New York and on Long Island was somehow milder or less brutal than it was on plantation slavery in the South. In reality, the scale may have been different, but the system was built on the same foundations of coercion, violence, and the legal ownership of human beings. For the women who lived within it, the daily realities of exploitation, surveillance, and reproductive control were no less profound simply because slavery took place on a smaller farm or within household spaces rather than on large plantations. The archives themselves also reflect this imbalance. Most of the documents historians rely upon, wills, ledgers, court records, diaries, and letters, are often created by enslavers. As a result, enslaved women often appear only indirectly in historical record. For historians, archivists, and even the everyday researcher or student, this creates a significant challenge. The documents that survive rarely tell us what enslaved women thought, how they understood their own lives, or how they experienced the world around them. Instead, we must reconstruct their stories from records that were never intended to preserve their voices. If enslaved women are so often absent from historical record, the question then becomes, how do we find them? The answer is, we rarely find them directly. Instead, we find them in fragments, embedded within records that were never meant to preserve their lives. The archives we rely on were created by enslavers, and as a result, enslaved women most often appear only when their labor, their bodies, or their children intersected with the interests of those who held power. They appear in wills, where they are listed alongside livestock and household goods, in account books, where their clothing or labor is assigned a monetary value, or in court records, where they surface only in moments of conflict or punishment. And in runaway advertisements, where physical descriptions, age, clothing, scars, skills, and offer some of the only glimpses of individuality and humanity that survive. To find enslaved women in the archive, we have to read these records differently. We have to look beyond the documents, what the documents were intended to record, and ask, what do they intentionally reveal? A line in a ledger might indicate not just a purchase, but a life lived within a household, or a life that was transferred from one household to another, leaving behind a family. A reference to illness might suggest exhaustion, resistance, or the physical toll of labor. A mention of a child might point to a family structure that the archive does not fully capture. This kind of reading requires us to treat absence itself as evidence. Silences in the archive are not empty. They are the result of systems that determined whose lives were worth recording and whose were not. In this way, recovering the lives of enslaved women is not simply a matter of finding new sources. It is a matter of asking new questions of the sources we already have, and willing to read against the grain of the archive to reconstruct that were never meant to be remembered, because their absence in itself is part of the violence of slavery. I'm just going to step aside so you guys can look at the slide behind me, particularly the advertisement, because, well, both. The advertisement, this side, lists everything she does, all of her skills, what she does, the fact that she does not drink, she had smallpox, she's excellent at washing clothing, everything. It does not say her name. None of it, not at all. The other is what I like to refer to as a self-emancipation ad. It's a runaway slave ad, and it's a woman whose name was Peg. She was 40 years old, and it lists not just what she was wearing, but what she looked like, what her attitude was, what her demeanor was. Many historians would look at these two advertisements in the past and only focus on the clothing. I like to look at it and see if I can see what this woman was like. One woman, her hand couldn't bend. What happened to her? The other one had smallpox. One was, I've read an ad where she's referred to as a likely Negro. What color was she? How pale was she? Sometimes they're listed as mulatto. Sometimes they're listed as wenches. Sometimes they're listed girls, boys. You have to read between the lines. Men are primarily mentioned in the runaway ads, mainly because they were able to escape quicker. Women were, like as I said, they were held in the house. They were under the constant eye of surveillance. Men were allowed to walk around a little bit more. They could escape. There were women who escaped in New York City more often. The runaway Peg, she was born in Oyster Bay, but she lived in New York City for several years. She had a little bit more freedom to walk around, possibly run an errand. She used that to her advantage and ran away. It shows the strength, the ingenuity, and the level of resistance this woman had to escape during this time period. So, give me 1 second to go back to where I was, because I love talking about women who run away. Let's see. Let's see, where is it? So that brings us back to the woman in the beginning. Wait, let me just re-say this one more time. Yep. So that brings us back to the woman in the beginning. The woman rising before dawn on a Long Island farm. The woman preparing meals while the household around her discusses liberty. The woman who heard the language of freedom, but it was denied to her. We will probably never know her name, but we can recognize a labor that shaped the world around her. And somewhere on Long Island, long after the speeches about liberty ended and the war was over, an enslaved woman still rose before dawn to begin another day at work. She lived through the American Revolution, but even though her labor helped birth a new nation, the ideals of the American Revolution were not meant for her. Thank you. Yeah, I talk fast so I can answer questions. I told him, I said,
okay. And just be careful walking in front of the speakers.
Oh, thank you. I do appreciate your lecture. I would like to know, you said that some women slaves had run away.
Mm-hmm.
And what's your knowledge of what did they do after that? Is there any documentation? Anything?
I've looked. Sometimes it will come up in records that they were recaptured. Sometimes it's not. I like to hope that they found a sloop, a boat, they made it somewhere. The one thing we have going for us in New York is, unlike in the South where it was, you could not escape, you had no place to go. Here in New York, there were pockets of free Black communities. So you were able to blend in. Some of the ads even say that some of the people who ran away pretended to be free even before they ran away. So they would go north, they would try to get to Canada, they would try to go to other places. Sometimes they would just blend into a free Black community in the city or other places. There were specific laws that if you were found within like 40 miles of Albany, north of Albany, away from Albany, you were going to be whipped because that was an area where people would try to go to remain free.
Thank you very much.
Let's get, I saw her first. And then...
Thank you so much. A number of years ago, there was a book written about Sylvester Manor called The Manor.
Yes.
Excellent book as far as I'm concerned. Do you know anything about the records at Sylvester Manor? Because I know she was able to see some of them and reflect those in the book.
Just from what I read in the book, the fascinating thing about Sylvester Manor and the matter in the book is that the amount of female-centric documents that were left behind, because typically they were, like these documents from the time period were created by men, but you have documents that are in their archives and in their collection that are written by women. The manor was more of a architectural look. There is a book, I cannot remember the name of the author just yet, but it's called Slavery Before Race, which looks at the enslavement of Sylvester Manor, people there through the Native Americans, the enslaved Africans, and that it's a very thin book, but it's very interesting. So they use they use the archaeological digs and the records from the household as well. I have a very morbid checklist of places to go. It's on my list of to go there, but every time I think about it, it's during the bad season of the summer, and I'm not going out that way.
Well, I've been there,
Yeah.
but it was before it had partially closed down.
Okay.
It is a fascinating place, but I'm not sure what's open and what's available anymore. At the time they had the. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, a lot of times with getting into those archives, you can do it. Sometimes you just have to prove that you are a researcher in some capacity. Some collections, I know from like archives, they will let you in. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes you have to request very specific things. A lot of those places have finding aids online. So if they have them there, look on their website, you'll be able to see what boxes you can request, and then you'll be able to possibly go there and look at some of them yourself. And some of the collections are digitized, but the scale of some of these collections, they're not all digitized.
Hi, I have actually two questions. One is, as a horse owner myself, and know that they used to, brand horses to keep in track of why weren't they branding or tattooing them so this way they didn't have to describe them? They could
Some of
just
them were branded.
Were they?
Some in the archives, they do come up
Okay.
in branding. There's this one woman who, her name escapes me, she had on her left shoulder TA. Branded on her. I don't know if that was her owner, if it was the ship that she was brought over on, if it was the company that owned her.
Right.
But they were branded.
Right.
If they were frequently runaways, they would have an R branded on their face. If they were thieves, they would have a T branded on their face.
Wow.
So they
Wow.
were branded. The branding, though, was something that was more done so later and in the South more often. But there is evidence of enslaved men and women having a brand somewhere on their body.
Right, okay.
But also at the same time, the interesting thing is, when you think about it, they didn't have photographs. So
Right,
if you have
right.
several enslaved women, all have the same brand, who is it? But at the same time...
Well, I don't mean like an icon, I mean like an actual number, so that, we say that, even if I sell this slave, that number would go with paperwork to the next owner, so that we could always say that's how they do it with breeding cows or anything else.
Yeah, they really, sometimes, like for some, they didn't really do stuff like that. Like the amount of branding I didn't see, it was more for like punishment.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
it was
good.
more for punishment.
Yeah, like the Scarlet A.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but much more permanent and physical than that.
Okay.
There were descriptions of, because we were different in New York. We weren't a self-sustaining slave population until about like around the time of the American Revolution. So a lot of our slaves were imported directly from the Caribbean or the West Indies or from Africa. So some of the descriptions actually have them with their tribal markings still on their faces and on their bodies. So there were a lot of other identifying ways that people could be identified in addition to brands.
I understand. The second thing I have is, again, I don't condone slavery. I never did. However, my concern is I don't know how women were treated if we never had taken them here to America. Were they treated the same way? I mean, in the tribe, were they treated as their workhorses? Were they?
It was different. Men and women.
Did men trade them?
No, they were respected. Depending on, it's like anywhere else in the world. Depending on their culture, their tribe, their areas. Some of them were matriarchs. Some of them were doctors, and some of them were not like chiefs, but they were pretty high up. They were well respected.
Okay.
They weren't like matriarchal societies, but they were pretty dang close.
Okay.
And but the slavery, it stripped everyone of their humanity. So it didn't matter. You could have been, a well-respected woman, but if another tribe came in and kidnapped you and sold you off, then you were just reduced to nothing. A nameless person who had to endure everything. No matter what they endured here would not even give, no matter what it was a different time period. Men and women were treated differently across the board, but what they endured here was nothing, didn't warrant them being dragged here. Where is he? There it is. Hello. Hi.
Thank you for all your work. This isn't about New York, but I just wonder what you as a historian think about how novelists treat the enslavement. And I was thinking of Toni Morrison's Beloved, and that's a book that really does get inside the experiences, the feelings, and so forth, that you say are so absent in just the list of clothing. And
it's fascinating because Beloved actually has a piece of actual historical fact in it. The killing of the child was actually based on a trial that was held in about like 1850, where a woman, she escaped slavery. She was captured, and she ended up killing one or two of her 3 children. So Toni Morrison does an excellent job. Other people, it depends. It's just like anything in history and the recreation. But that's the thing also, is that people will go to the archives, and if they would come to Long Island, do a story about slavery on Long Island, and they stop at the 2 books that they looked at, if they come up to me, a librarian, and say, tell me about slavery, and I hand them those 2 books, that's what they're going to write about. But if they look deeper into the archives and actually read them differently, they can present a much more wholly told story about enslavement. So Toni Morrison actually does an exquisite job. Other books, not so much.
We can unfortunately only take one more question here, but in the break we can people can talk to you as long as that's okay.
Okay, yeah.
All right. So.
I was just curious about the United States at the time when slaves were trying to get free and go north. Were there any states that supported their freedom, like Maine, Vermont?
There were a few states up in, I can't remember. They didn't really support them. They just didn't really codify slavery. So part of the problem is, like, if you notice, I never say African Americans, I never say Black Americans, because they weren't American citizens at the time. They weren't, citizens of the state or anything like that. So there were some states, there were pockets, there were areas where people could go through. But we think of like New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they were all slaveholding. Connecticut, slaveholding. I'm trying to remember, Vermont, maybe, there was a state where they did not have slaves counted, but I haven't looked into them directly, because when I study this more often, I look into Connecticut, the tri-state area, because we were connected to Connecticut more than we were to New York City and stuff like that at the time out here. So I know, looking very briefly at certain maps and numbers, I know that there's some pieces, but if you give me your name, I can look it up for you, and I can tell you more about that. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break. Everyone get up, or not, whatever you want to do. We'll come back around 1:15, and I'll introduce Carly Hench. But for now, maybe take a short break. And also, if you see Melanie, I'm not sure where Melanie is. I'm sure she'll answer any questions between now and 1:15. We also have after the break, during the refreshment break, I think Melanie might have to go. I'm not sure. But also, I brought my mother's huge yellow Pyrex bowl. I'm going to put it on the stage for business cards, and if you have any questions, throw them in there. That'll be out for the rest of the conference. But anyway, thank you so much, and we'll see you back at 1:15.